Wang Chong turned his gaze back to the walls of Khorasan, smiling as he squinted at the two figures standing there. Abu Muslim, Ziad, I've already given you a chance. Since you're not willing to surrender, then I'll do as you wish and have you live and die with this city. With these words, Wang Chong closed his eyes and became motionless. The 200,000 soldiers behind him were also like sculptures, none of them showing any signs of movement. But this only made the pair standing on the wall even more uneasy. No one knew what Wang Chong was scheming. Abu Muslim turned to Ziad. Ziad, check again. We can't allow Samarkand to be repeated. The gates must be kept under strict watch. If any Sassanid tries to approach, they must be killed without question. In addition, has the news reached Baghdad? When will our reinforcements arrive? Khorasan was the final gateway of the Arabian East. Once Khorasan was lost, the Arabian capital of Baghdad would be threatened. The two were only 2,000 some kilometers from each other. Only a few days would be needed to travel the distance. In the Arabian Empire's history of constant conquest and expansion, this was the first time an enemy had ever gotten so close. This was the reason Abu Muslim had not continued to flee westward, instead choosing to remain in Khorasan. I've already checked. All the city gates are under heavy guard. No mishaps will occur. The news has already reached Baghdad, but all the nobles in the capital are in panic. In addition, in the previous battle, the forces of Cairo, Qutaybah's northern war zone, and our own forces were deployed, and the eastern half of the empire has been essentially emptied out. There are no soldiers behind us that can be deployed. Although there are still other governors with their own armies, they wouldn't be able to make it in time. The closest army would need at least half a month, and it doesn't have many soldiers. Even if it managed to make it, it's not guaranteed to be of much help, Ziad frankly reported. As he spoke, his gaze flitted over the vast sea of soldiers, a force of 200,000 soldiers made up of the Great Tang, Khorasan, and other factions. Every time he saw it, he felt a chill in his heart. When Arabia and the Great Tang had first begun to fight, the Tang army had only been 110,000, but now, the ranks of their army had swelled to an astonishing 200,000. And all of these soldiers exuded abnormal strength, their bodies seething with killing intent as they stood arrayed outside the city. The rebels and survivors of old dynasties that he and Abu Muslim had failed to find were now borrowing the strength of the Great Tang to emerge from their hiding places. This was something Abu Muslim and Ziad had never imagined. Abu Muslim's heart sank upon hearing Ziad's report. At this time, he could only depend on himself. The only thought he had to comfort him was that as long as the gates stood, he still had time to wait for reinforcements. It's not right. As he stared out the enemy, Abu Muslim's eyes suddenly went wide, and a thought suddenly occurred to him. There's something strange. There must be something that we haven't noticed. Ziad, bring a group and examine the soldiers again. If you find any Khorasani spy, kill them on the spot. Abu Muslim was treating every tree and bush as an enemy soldier, and he would prefer to kill a wrong soldier than let a potential spy go. Khorasan was simply too important. If it were lost, then even if he managed to survive, his fate would be little different from death. But, milord, if the Tang want to take Khorasan, they have to breach the walls. The gates are under our control, so how can they get in? And we've recruited 30,000 militia. Even if there are spies in Khorasan, they will find it very difficult to shake our position. What are they going to do? Drop from the sky? Drop from the sky? Abu Muslim's eyes widened at Ziad's last words. He seemed to grasp at something, but he couldn't yet determine what it was. For a moment, time seemed to stop. As Abu Muslim was frozen in thought, a loud bang came from the southeast part of Khorasan. At that moment, numerous soldiers began to holler and shout. Buzz! The sounds of fighting caused Abu Muslim to tremble as if he had been struck by a lightning bolt. He had finally realized what was wrong. Wang Chong and his men might not be able to come in from the sky like birds, but that didn't mean they couldn't come out of the ground. Although the Tang weren't familiar with this place and didn't have the time to excavate a tunnel underneath the walls, the same could not be said of the Sassanids. And most importantly, this had once been the capital of the Sassanid dynasty. Damn it! Abu Muslim's face twisted and contorted, his hard and determined face instantly turning into a nasty grimace. He knew that he had still managed to underestimate Wang Chong. But by the time Abu Muslim could react, a roar came from outside the city. The motionless army of 200,000 soldiers gave heaven-shaking bellows, and as the pair of Arab commanders watched, they began to push out metal weapons from the rear. Fire! Su Hanshan swung his hand down, upon which these metal weapons hastily constructed by Zhang Shouji fired sharp metal anchors from long metallic tubes. Ding ding ding! The sharp metal anchors, dragging out long ropes behind them, firmly stabbed into the walls. Flying grapples! These were weapons that Zhang Shouji had ordered his craftsmen to create while on the westward march. Although time had been short, the grand craftsman Zhang Shouji had succeeded in creating many of these flying grapples. These objects had a very simple structure. All they required were formidable elastic force and firing power, which were no problem for someone who had studied the mysteries of ballisty. Discarding the more complicated components and leaving only the crucial parts had resulted in the flying grapples. Go! Everyone, prepare to ascend and attack the walls. With this order, countless soldiers began to climb up the ropes like monkeys, quickly ascending the walls. Everyone, attack! Clang! Bahram unsheathed the sharp-wit steel sword and thrust it into the air. The 8,000-some Aswaran cataphracts charged into Khorasan through the tunnel that had been furtively excavated in the era of the Sassanid dynasty. The imperial household of Khorasan and the Aswaran cataphracts had used precisely this tunnel to escape from the Arabs and vanish without a trace. Now it had become a vital tool in attacking the Arabs in Khorasan. Hurry! Stop them! Hack off the anchors! Cut down the ropes! We can't let them climb up! On the high walls, the Arabs were in a state of panic. Everyone began to move, vigorously hacking at the flying grapples. Hurry! Abu Muslim furiously roared, both shocked and angered by this sight. Boom! Pitch-black energy exploded out of his body. Clang, clang, clang. 10 some sharp flying grapples were immediately pulverized. Ha ha ha, Abu Muslim. There's no need to waste your strength. You've already lost this battle. Wang Chong loudly laughed, and then he stomped on the ground. The stellar energy in his body exploded with the roar of a dragon. An enormous golden dragon rapidly spiraled into the air, soaring toward the walls of Khorasan. Leaping dragon art. At his new level of cultivation, the same techniques displayed vastly different levels of power. The walls of Khorasan seemed to soar into the clouds and were almost impossible to jump up to. But things were different with Wang Chong's leaping dragon art. Bang! The moment the first leaping dragon art's energy was about spent and his speed began to slow, Wang Chong pressed his right foot against the back of his left foot. There was immediately a metallic boom, and a visible shockwave emerged from the bottom of Wang Chong's foot. Relying on this repulsive power, Wang Chong once more spiraled into the sky as a golden dragon. Once, twice, thrice. In just a few seconds, before anyone could react, Wang Chong had appeared on the edge of Khorasan's high walls. Great Yin-Yang heaven creation art, Wang Chong yelled in a cold and callous voice. At the same moment, a light more dazzling than the sun exploded from his body. In the blink of an eye, Wang Chong had become a fierce red sun that occupied half the sky of Khorasan. Ah! The moment this red blazing sun appeared, screams began to fill the air. On the walls, the surprised Arab soldiers felt the blood and energy pouring out of their bodies and surging into Wang Chong. 20 to 30 of them that had been vigorously hacking at the flying grapples were immediately sucked dry and dropped to the ground. And this was far from the only effect of the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art. "Milord, watch out!" Ziad cried out in alarm. Even though Ziad was doing his utmost to resist, his blood and energy were still escaping his control and being drawn away by the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art. And Abu Muslim was in almost exactly the same situation. Now that Wang Chong was a great general and had reached the peak of this realm, his strength had risen to an inconceivable level. He was also extremely proficient in a variety of martial arts, and his mastery over the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art could make any expert tremble in fear. Even though Abu Muslim and Ziad had recuperated the majority of their energy, they were still no match for Wang Chong. Damn it! Abu Muslim's eyes twitched. Wang Chong had appeared too quickly, needing only a few seconds to appear on the walls. Get out of my way! Abu Muslim gathered up all the black energy around him and viciously flung it at Wang Chong. As he struck, he began to rapidly withdraw. In a ringing explosion, black and gold energy clashed in the air. The collision of stellar energy caused that powerful suction force to immediately vanish, and Abu Muslim's stern resistance caused Wang Chong to tremble and fall from the wall. Haha! Abu Muslim, it's pointless. Even Qutayba was killed. Do you really think you have the ability to exchange blows with me? With a single thought from Wang Chong, the air for hundreds of feet around him was thrown into turmoil, all the air raging and churning under Wang Chong's control. Wang Chong's body also exploded with an immense suction power. By aiming at the thick walls of Khurasan, Wang Chong was able to pull himself back up the wall. Great destruction art. Without the slightest hesitation, Wang Chong used the strongest move of the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art. The entire world seemed to become deathly still, and all light began to distort. From a distance, the walls of Khurasan seemed to have been plunged into darkness, and deep within this darkness was a most dreadful destructive energy. Not good! With a loud bellow, Abu Muslim and Ziyad both trembled, looks of extreme shock on their faces. Ocean Ring, Asmodee's fury, enraged and dismayed, both of them used their strongest moves. Rumble. 3 torrents of energy collided in the air, and then there was a mighty explosion. Ah! Ziyad and Abu Muslim were both flung back, screaming. Meanwhile, Wang Chong flew up, flipping in the air before smoothly landing on the walls. Thud thud thud. The enormous power of the attack forced Abu Muslim to take 6 or 7 steps back before he finally succeeded in stabilizing himself. Nearby, Ziyad's chest trembled and he vomited blood. He raised his face and stared at Wang Chong as if a demon god had descended, his eyes tinged with despair. He knew that Wang Chong was strong, but not this strong. The two of them together were simply no match for him. How could this be? How could a single person become this strong in such a short amount of time? There's no one else like this Tang who can advance in power so quickly. Ziyad could feel pain in every part of his body, and his eyes were ashen and lifeless. Everyone needed many months and years to advance from the basic level of great general to the very summit, but Wang Chong had managed to achieve this astonishing transformation in just a few days. Even as he thought back to it, Ziyad still felt immense shock. All of this was enough to make anyone despair. Abu Muslim, Ziyad, everything is over. Let this place be your end. Hand over your lives. Wang Chong's eyes were sharp, and his loud voice resounded to the horizon. Abu Muslim had been the one to start this war, for the sake of Arabia's ambitions on the Great Tang. Now it was time for this war to end with the two of them. Boom! A vast sea of psychic energy flew through the air, dividing into two and stabbing like spears into the minds of Abu Muslim and Ziyad. While these two were having their minds shaken, Wang Chong's halo clattered and golden stellar energy erupted from his body. With a heaven-toppling momentum, he charged at Abu Muslim and Ziyad. Kakrak! Even before Wang Chong's attack had landed, the sturdy walls beneath the pair began to groan and sink, cracks appearing across their surface. The entire city of Khurasan began to quake, completely incapable of enduring the power of this dreadful strike. Run! Even Abu Muslim and Ziyad paled at this strike. The strength Wang Chong had displayed had completely exceeded theirs. This was a strength that made them despair. Bang! Abu Muslim's eyes gleamed with resolve, and he suddenly stomped down, shrouding himself in frenzied energy as he prepared to charge at Wang Chong. But just as Abu Muslim was prepared to move, an energy came from behind him and viciously pushed him back. "Milord, get out of here. I'll cover for you." Before Abu Muslim could react, Ziyad was already rushing at Wang Chong, his eyes streaked with blood and his face determined. He would not be able to escape. After so many battles, he had accumulated injuries far worse than Abu Muslim's. Moreover, Ziyad knew that Wang Chong would never let him escape. In his current state, his chance of surviving was minuscule. Moreover, with Qutayba, Ibak, and Osman dead, if even his commanding officer Abu Muslim died as well, Then the caliph would have no other choice than to execute him so that he could accompany all the other governors who had been killed in battle. "My lord, we fought together for 10 some years. My lord has always taken care of me, so now, let me take care of my lord. At the very least, if my lord can survive, you will still have a chance to avenge me and Lord Kateba." Ziad's hair was blown about by the fierce winds, and as he stared at Wang Chong, his hands clenched into fists. "Tang, come. Let's fight to the death." Ziad howled, and then without the slightest hesitation, he threw out the ocean ring. Countless waves of black energy immediately began to converge on Wang Chong. "Not knowing your own strength," Wang Chong coldly snorted. The golden light on his body surged, rumbling like a mighty wave as it shattered Ziad's attack with one blow. Clack! Before anyone else could react, Wang Chong had shot forward and wrapped his fingers around Ziad's neck, sealing off his stellar energy as he slowly raised him into the air. With the power of the ocean ring, Ziad had a strength similar to Chang Qianli in the form of the supreme desolation god. 7 or 8 days ago, before Wang Chong had broken into the Imperial Great General level, Ziad might have had a chance. But now, if Ziad thought that he could contend against Wang Chong, he was truly naive. But to his surprise, the captured and doomed Ziad cared little for his own fate or what danger he was in. He put all the strength in his body into a single heart-wrenching roar. "My lord, hurry and go!" This roar was like a thunderclap, shaking the souls of many and even startling Wang Chong. He had never imagined that there was actually a person like Ziad amongst the pugnacious and fierce Arabs. At the final moment, he was not thinking of himself, but Abu Muslim, completely disregarding his own life. Whoosh! The winds howled. 100 some feet away, Abu Muslim had been just preparing to charge at Wang Chong when he suddenly heard that roar. His body trembled while great waves tossed and turned in his mind. "Ziad!" Abu Muslim ground his teeth so hard that they seemed on the verge of shattering. "Run!" Ziad sternly said. "Kill!" At this time, the air resounded with the sounds of fighting, and close to Abu Muslim, a great Tang soldier appeared, the first to scale the walls with a flying grapple. Behind him, more and more people were reaching the top of the walls. "Charge with me! Open the gates!" The city itself was also in chaos, weapons clanging against each other as more and more Khorasani entered Khorasan through the tunnel. The 8,000 some Aswaran cataphracts that the Arabs had spent so much time searching for had appeared before them in a completely unexpected fashion, and were now swiftly charging at the gates. Abu Muslim could also see that Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and the demonic Emperor Old Man were also converging on his position. The battle was settled. At this moment, Abu Muslim understood that whether he was willing or not, whether he stayed or not, Khorasan was foreordained to be breached. Ah! Even someone as cold and brutal as Abu Muslim couldn't help but give a furious and grief-stricken roar. "Wang Chong, Gao Xianji, the grudges between us won't end like this. There will come a day when I come back with another army and finally step onto the lands of the Central Plains." With these words, Abu Muslim jumped off the walls and fled like a lightning bolt into the distance. An Aswaran cataphract tried to catch up, but with a single palm, he was blown more than 500 feet away. Even before his body had landed, his famed suit of armor had already been shattered into pieces. "Humph! Abu Muslim, you won't get the chance," Wang Chong sneered. He activated the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art while also snapping Ziad's neck. Wang Chong felt no sympathy for these enemies of the Great Tang. An invader had to be prepared to pay the price for a failed invasion. Abu Muslim had just been pushed to desperate straits. If this pair had managed to win, they would probably have been showing grim and savage expressions, and calamity would have befallen the people of the Great Tang. Wang Chong glanced at Ziad's corpse and coldly said, "Sympathizing with the enemy is just being cruel to oneself. Ziad, be at ease. Abu Muslim will be joining you very soon." Wang Chong made a gesture, and a group of Tang soldiers quickly descended the walls and made their way to the eastern gates of Khorasan. In the distance, 10 some Aswaran cataphracts were also making their way to this gate. Rumble. A few moments later, the tall and firm gates of Khorasan began to slowly open. Khorasan had been formally breached. "How is it? Should we pursue?" In a gust of wind, Gao Xianji approached Wang Chong from behind, his eyes gazing in the direction that Abu Muslim had fled. "There's no need." Wang Chong and Gao Xianji stood side by side, staring at the city of Khurasan, which was clouded with plumes of dust and smoke. Abu Muslim is the kind of person that is very difficult to catch if he focuses on escaping, and this city is so large that it would be very hard to find him. Moreover, what we need to think about next is not about another battle or killing any particular person, but the overall strategic situation. "General Chang, have you finished preparing the letter I spoke to you about?" Chang Qianli lightly nodded as he rushed out from the rear. "It was prepared some time ago. She was the writer, and it can be sent to Baghdad through those Arabian hunting falcons at any time." Top-class great generals always seem to only think about the outcome of a battle, but Wang Chong pondered the strategic situation as well. His insight was enough to make any great general of the continent pale in comparison, and this was also the reason Chang Qianli admired him. The army quickly surged in, and without the support of Abu Muslim or Ziyad, the tens of thousands of Arab soldiers collapsed and were wiped out far faster than any time before. For hours after the gates had been opened, Wang Chong's army had taken control over the strategic city at the western terminus of the Silk Road. "Is this the Tigris River?" On the western side of Khurasan, Wang Chong, Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, Li Sai, Yuan Shusong, and Bahram all gazed toward the end of the walls. From this point, Wang Chong could immediately see a vast and wide river surging past Khurasan. This river was 500 to 600 feet wide and extremely deep. Although its flow was rapid, it was not as turbid as imagined. This was the first time in Wang Chong's life that he had seen one of the two most famous rivers of the Sassanid Empire. One was the Tigris River and the other was the Euphrates. These were the foundations of the Sassanid dynasty civilization, and they now served as the two most important rivers of the Arabian Empire. This is only a tributary of the Tigris River. The main branch is even wider and more magnificent than what you see here. We Sassanids were able to produce thousands of years of history, becoming the strongest country on the shores of the Great Sea, precisely because of these two rivers. But both of them now belong to the Arabian Empire. They exact a heavy tax on anyone that wants to cross the river. When traveling east and west, we Sassanids have to traverse these two rivers. Every year, vast sums of wealth are plundered from us and sent to the Arabian treasury, Bahram emotionally said. Wang Chong silently listened. A few thoughts flitted through his mind, but he quickly put them aside. History was already very different from what Wang Chong remembered. At least in Wang Chong's memories, there was no tributary of the Tigris River outside Khurasan. His eyes paused on this river famed throughout Arabia for a few moments, and then he slowly raised his head toward the infinite horizon. There Wang Chong saw a vast capital. That place was the true center of politics, power, culture, and military on the entire western end of the continent. Baghdad. A name flashed through Wang Chong's mind. Abu Muslim had wanted to break Talas, occupy the western regions, and encroach upon the central plains. Ironically, at the very end, Abu Muslim had failed to threaten Chang'an. Instead, Wang Chong had campaigned westward, venturing deep into Arabia along the Silk Road and occupying Khurasan, this city on the western terminus of the Silk Road. "General Chang, let's begin," Wang Chong ordered without turning his head. "Yes." Chang Qianli had barely finished replying when an Arabian hunting falcon soared into the sky, heading toward the capital of the Arabian Empire, Baghdad. 2,200 kilometers was a very short distance. Proceeding from Khurasan across the Tigris River, and then westward for another 1,300-some kilometers, was the heart of the Arabian Empire. This city was grandiose, towers and domed palaces soaring into the sky. In this place, many soldiers, millions of civilians, and countless merchants had gathered. The economy, culture, and political scene were all extremely developed. This place was Baghdad, the vast heart of the Arabian Empire. In the west, it had another resounding name, the Sleepless City. In this city, people worked and celebrated throughout the day and into the night. Cree. Suddenly, a sharp cry rang out over Baghdad. A massive Arabian hunting falcon unfurled its wings, its feathers shaking in the wind, and then it plunged down like a sharp arrow, flying into the highest building in Baghdad, the Imperial Palace. Rumble. This hunting falcon's entrance into the Imperial Palace was like a giant boulder crashing down, setting off massive waves in the empire. Bastard! A thunderous roar came from the golden-roofed Imperial Palace, echoing throughout all of Arabia. Countless governors, generals, and nobles kneeled down, their bodies trembling in fear. In the highest reaches of the hall, seated on a throne cast from gold, was the Caliph of Arabia, Mutasim dressed in robes of white and silver thread and wearing a crown of gold. At this moment, his eyes were spitting flame and lightning. Mutasim was hailed as the greatest sovereign in the history of the Arabian Empire. Under his command, the Arabian Empire had conquered numerous factions, increasing the empire's territory until it could be increased no more, attaining an age of unprecedented power and prosperity. Countless ministers and generals and millions of elite soldiers were ready for battle, awaiting his command to go out and conquer the world. To say that he was one of the most authoritative and also one of the physically strongest rulers of this world would not be excessive. But at this moment, all the resplendence and glory he had created had become nothing. The behemoth army had been wiped out, the skyquaking army had been heavily wounded, Qutayba was dead, Ibak was dead, Osman was dead, the Mamelukes had been destroyed. He had heard far too much terrible news recently. Mutasim had originally been extremely hopeful about this eastern campaign. He hoped that his vast army would be able to conquer the east and unite the continent, accomplishing a feat of unprecedented scale. But now all these dreams were no more. Not only that, an eastern infidel great general and his army were now threatening his Baghdad. And they had made an extremely overbearing demand. This was an enormous humiliation that Mutasim could not endure. Your Majesty, these Tang have only given us 3 days to reply, but a messenger bird will require 2 days to travel. Down below, an Arab minister bedecked with jewels kneeled on the ground and spoke in a frightened tone. If they don't receive our reply or receive a refusal, they will immediately cross the Tigris River and besiege even more cities. This would cause the entire empire to panic. Mutasim was like an enraged lion as he roared, "Useless thing! We have so many soldiers and countless governors and generals. Can they be threatened by a single infidel? Pass on our decree. Wipe out these Tang together with these rebels." Bzzz. The palace became eerily quiet. Everyone kneeled, their heads pressed to the ground. Why aren't you saying anything? Speak. We have so many soldiers, so many generals. Can they not even wipe out a measly 200,000 soldiers? Mutasim angrily rebuked. An Arab general hesitantly spoke up. Your Majesty. In the previous battle, we sent the forces of Cairo and the northern and eastern war zones to Talas, an army totaling more than 500,000 soldiers. In the defeat at Talas, almost the entire army was wiped out. Right now, there are no more soldiers available in the eastern region. Another general gathered his courage and added, "That is not all. Qutayba and Abu Muslim have always been the 2 strongest governors, and the number of people in the empire that can be compared to them can be counted with one's fingers. Even if we send soldiers, it will be very hard to overcome the enemy. Moreover, gathering soldiers is not something that can be completed in just 3 or 5 days, but if we do not immediately reply to the demand of these infidels, they will immediately cross the Tigris River and attack all our cities, even Baghdad." Crack. The 2 had barely finished speaking when a crisp crack rang through the hall. Mutasim clenched fingers had crushed the right armrest of his throne into powder. His fair and white face was now thoroughly red. As the strongest sovereign in the history of the Arabian Empire, he had never been forced into a situation where he had no soldiers available to him. 1 billion taels of gold. 1 billion taels. Do all of you mean that we should agree to the demand of this madman from the east, accept this extortion, and give them so much wealth? Mutasim was furious, his eyes gloomy and dark. 1 billion taels of gold. Even though Arabia had plundered the treasures of countless countries and factions over its hundreds of years of conquest, accumulating vast sums of wealth, this was still an enormous price. But, Your Majesty, if we do not agree, We will lose far more than 1 billion taels of gold, an Arab noble said in a trembling voice. They can advance from Khorasan and occupy even more land. 200,000 soldiers together with those skilled Eastern great generals is not something we can deal with in the short time available. In the end, even if we managed to drive them out of the empire, we would sustain severe losses. The cities of the East were in a perilous situation. Those 200,000 soldiers that remained in Khorasan, biding their time, were even more intimidating than if they had actually begun to attack. While threatening dozens of cities, they demanded 1 billion taels of gold as war compensation. But this was really just a ransom. Such a thing was unprecedented and unheard of, and not even during the Arabian Empire's constant expansion had there ever been a similar incident. But all of them had to seriously consider their options. The enemy had the strength, ambition, and daring, and the vast expanse of land they had conquered between Samarkand and Khorasan was proof that they were not just bluffing. Boom! The Arab noble had barely spoken when a golden boot suddenly stomped down. As everyone watched with reverential gazes, Mutisim III stood up from his throne. At that moment, the entire world seemed to shake and sway, the grandiose city of Baghdad unable to bear the weight of this power. We will not be threatened by anyone. Even if all the cities of the East are destroyed and their people slaughtered, we will never accept such extortion from an Eastern madman. Let him come to take the 1 billion taels of gold himself. Even if we must pay the price of half the city, we still wish to personally tear his corpse to pieces. Mutisim III could no longer restrain his rage, and his eyes were like lightning bolts, shining with intimidating light. In the face of the enraged caliph, everyone fell silent, none of them daring to say a word. In the Arabian Empire, the caliph's words were absolute. Once he made a decision, no one dared to try to stop him or defy him. Just when the temperature had reached freezing point, a hoarse and mysterious voice came from outside, echoing within the hall. If I were your majesty, I would send those 1 billion taels of gold. The sound of this voice caused everyone to shudder. No one had expected that someone would speak up at this moment, daring to provoke the caliph's wrath. But a moment later, just when everyone was shocked at the daring of this mysterious individual, there was a flash of light, and then a long shadow was cast into the hall. At some point, a tall and black-robed figure had appeared at the entrance to the hall. His pitch-black and wide robe was embroidered with mysterious characters made of golden thread. High Priest! An Arab noble trembled at the sight of this figure, his eyes going wide. No one had expected that the mysterious person who had dared to oppose the caliph was that most enigmatic individual of the Arabian Empire, the wielder of divine authority, the High Priest. This was undoubtedly the most unexpected guest the imperial palace had received. This was a legendary existence who had lived in the empire for several hundred years. Although almost no one had truly met the High Priest, everyone recognized his unique sun-god robes, as well as the gnarled black staff of the temple. One of the High Priest's thin hands had reached out of its sleeve like a bird's claw to grip the staff, and churning black mist was endlessly flowing out of the sleeve. His hood was pulled down, completely obscuring his face. He was simply standing at the entrance, motionless, and yet none of the governors, generals, or nobles in the hall could perceive his cultivation level. Although he had truly and physically appeared before them, all of them could only sense that black and gnarled staff. Besides that, there seemed to be nothing else there. Buzz! The High Priest's robes moved as he crossed the threshold and entered. High Priest, when did you get here? To everyone's surprise, the furious and frenzied Mutisim III seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon, all the rage draining out of him. Not only had he ceased to be angry, he even looked pleasantly surprised. Bang, bang, bang. He excitedly rushed off the dais to personally welcome his guest. Everyone in Arabia knew the caliph's attitude toward the High Priest. But only at this moment did they realize how highly he regarded him. Talaz was a defeat, Qutayba was killed, and the Tang from the east have taken Khorasan and now threaten Baghdad. How could I not come after such major events? The High Priest indifferently said as he slowly walked forward. As he walked, the air rippled out from him like bright waves of water, emerging with each step he took. Not only that, as the high priest walked, even his body became fainter, becoming itself like a faint wave of water. It was like the person passing by was not a real person, but simply a faint ripple. Swoosh! In a flash, everyone retreated to the sides. Even the governors couldn't help but lower their heads and yield the path. The governors were of varying cultivation levels, but all of them were extremely capable. Yet they couldn't even sense the high priest's breathing. All they could sense was a thick darkness that could devour all, instilling fear and dread in them. A few moments later, the high priest stopped in front of the caliph. He did not bow nor show any of the respect a subject should have. He seemed to exude an aura that transcended imperial authority. From a certain standpoint, this was an offense against the caliph. But the caliph appeared to not care. Not only that, the caliph appeared to treat the high priest with great respect. The caliph strode before the high priest and said, "High priest, you came at just the right time. We have so many soldiers and so many generals. Must we be threatened by a child from the east of 10 some years? Arabs live for battle, and no one who surrenders can be called a warrior. We still have half an empire and 1 million elites. Must we yield to the Tang of the East? It is only 1 billion taels of gold. Is your majesty so lacking for money?" The high priest did not directly reply, instead bringing up another matter. "This?" The caliph slightly raised his head, a scornful look in his eyes as he proudly declared, 1 billion taels is a vast sum, but given what the empire has accumulated over the centuries, it is possible to produce it. To many dynasties, countries, and even large empires, 1 billion taels of gold was an astronomical sum. When Wang Chong had requested reinforcements from the imperial court for the Battle of Talas, the Bureau of Personnel had only given him 20 million taels of gold, and the imperial court had actually considered this to be too much. 1 billion taels of gold was 50 times the sum Wang Chong had used to fund his campaign and was enough to buy quite a few cities. But this was not a sum that the Arabian Empire would find impossible to bear. This was the advantage of habitually plundering a conquered country of everything it had upon victory. The Great Tang, restricted by its system of rights and etiquette, simply could not compare. However, the only countries that could compare with Arabia in single-handedly creating such wealth were those of the Central Plains. The caliph's eyes went sharp as he firmly declared, "I can produce 1 billion taels of gold, but I cannot accept the conditions of those Easterners and yield to them. Never." This was no longer a matter of money. Accepting the Tang's conditions was submission, humiliation. As the highest commander of the Arabian Empire, the caliph could never endure such a thing. It's just 1 billion taels of gold. How is it now submission? Is your majesty prepared to surrender without a fight? The high priest nonchalantly said, his expression confident and relaxed. This was something only the high priest could do, daring to speak to the supreme caliph in this way, acting like he possessed an authority above imperial authority, and yet not being blamed by the caliph. How is this possible? The caliph was stunned at first, but he quickly denied the possibility. We still have many soldiers in the southern war zone, western war zone, and the other war zones. These soldiers can all be mobilized. It's just a measly army of 200,000. Once we have finished mobilizing the army, the only thing awaiting them is death. The caliph clenched his fists, his voice brimming with killing intent. Arabia was a country founded on war, and this was precisely the reason for his anger. That commander from the Great Tang called Wang Chong had sent a letter threatening that if he did not receive a reply in 3 days, a compensation of 1 billion taels of gold, he would immediately continue his advance westward and occupy even more cities. To Mutasim III, who had always been unyielding and whose attitude had always greatly influenced the governors and generals beneath him, this was nothing more than a brazen challenge and humiliation. This had the caliph practically apoplectic. Moreover, although Qutayba and Ibak had been killed, he had only lost 2 top-class figures. Arabia still had many more top-class fighting powers. Then that's not the case. Since your majesty still has many soldiers and is preparing for an even larger war, how could this be considered surrender? For someone of your majesty's abilities, gold and silver should be worthless. 1 billion taels of gold is simply to comfort and soothe these Tang. I hear that the great Tang values benevolence and righteousness. Once they receive the money, they will keep their promise. Your Majesty only needs to temporarily soothe them. When the army arrives, the cities to the west of the Tigris can be protected from their attacks, and we can also assault Khorasan and wipe out the Tang and rebel soldiers in one fell swoop. At the same time, we will also be able to recover the gold. The high priest's scratchy voice resounded in everyone's ears. 1 billion taels of gold is not a small number, and even if they whip their horses, they won't be able to run very far. Once we breach Khorasan, your Majesty can send cavalry in pursuit and regain the gold all the same. Moreover, hasn't your Majesty been fruitlessly searching for those former nobles and rebel soldiers all this time? We can use these Tang to bring in all the rebels. We would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and snaring them all with a single net. Buzz! The Caliph raised his head in shock. He had been so enraged by the demanded compensation of 1 billion taels of gold that he hadn't thought about anything else. It was true. Those former nobles and rebel soldiers of the conquered countries had always vexed Arabia. For the last 10-some years, the empire had gone to great effort to find any trace of these rebels. The behemoth army, Mamelukes, skyquaking army, and even the Arab war god Qutayba had once been dispatched by Mutisim III to surround and suppress these rebels. But these former nobles and rebels were like moles, burrowing into the ground the moment the army arrived and refusing to come out. And once the army left, they would come back up and start making trouble again. Without pacifying these rebellions, the empire would never know peace, nor would it ever fully control those regions. The problem of rebels had always worried Mutisim III, and he had even lost sleep over the matter. But now that he thought about it, although these Tang had come with a great momentum, they had also succeeded in drawing out all the hidden nobles and rebels. Just as the high priest had said, he just needed to soothe them until the army arrived and then finish them off in one fell swoop, settling the matter once and for all. If he could use this matter to wipe out all of them, then even being coerced and threatened for 1 billion taels of gold by these Tang was not out of the question. This was truly killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Mutisim III's pupils constricted, and he suddenly fell quiet. His brows twitched as he lowered his head and began to think. Mutisim III turned to a kneeling and silent governor and asked, "Huller, how much time will it take for the soldiers from the other areas to arrive?" Empire's white corpse, Huller, although he was not as strong or as famous as the Arab war god Qutayba, he had also forged his reputation through numerous battles. He had gained his name because his skin was so pale that it seemed like that of a corpse. But even so, in the surrounding countries, Huller was just as infamous as the governor of Iron and Blood, Abu Muslim. He was callous, brutal, and bloodthirsty, and in certain aspects he was even more formidable than Abu Muslim. The majority of his opponents ended up dying very grisly and wretched deaths. Of all the governors that had been gathered in Baghdad due to Qutayba's death, the most renowned was probably this empire's white corpse. Huller was undoubtedly the best commander to deal with the 200,000 Tang and rebel soldiers in Khorasan. This was also why the Caliph had aimed this question at him. Huller thought for a while before finally standing up and saying, "Your Majesty, if we move quickly, the army can be gathered in 7 days. But these would all be ordinary soldiers, incapable of posing much of a threat to the high walls of Khorasan. If we want to gather enough elite soldiers and great generals to completely vanquish the foe at Khorasan, we need at least 15 days, perhaps even 20. Have the soldiers march through the night. In at most 10 days, I want all the soldiers to arrive at Khorasan. I cannot permit these eastern infidels to occupy Khorasan for a single day more." Mutisim III said, his voice brooking no objection. Huller hesitated for only a few moments before firmly declaring, "This general will go." Time was short, and it was almost impossible for Arabia to gather enough soldiers from its various war zones and march them to Khorasan. But though the task was onerous, as long as the soldiers marched through the night, Empire's white corpse Huller believed the task to not be impossible. All that was required was just a few losses during the march. This simply wasn't something that Huller was concerned about. Rumble. The bitter loss in the east, the death of Qutayba, the loss of Khorasan, and Wang Chong's threat. All these things enraged the Arabian Empire, causing it to come to life like some giant war machine and swiftly mobilize its soldiers. The stench of war only thickened, rather than weakening. In the domed hall of Khorasan, the Anshi Protectorate Army's number 4 individual, Lu Shi, couldn't help but speak his mind. Lord Protector General, the next Arabian city is only several dozen li from us, and its defenses are unmanned. As long as we are willing, our 200,000 men can cross the Tigris River and occupy the city without bloodshed. And General Bahram has also said that there are 10 some more cities farther west, and there are no natural barriers between these cities. If we are willing, we can quickly occupy this territory. Why has Milord decided to halt the march and order the army to rest in this place? This Arabian palace was gorgeous, and its domed roof was covered in delicate ivy patterns. The smooth and marble-covered floors were also entirely different from the floors of the central plains. The ground was even studded with pearls and agate, a level of luxury that left everyone astonished. But at this moment, whether it was Gao Shenji, Chang Qianli, Shi Yuanqing, Li Sai, the black-armored guard, Su Hanshan, or Xue Qianjun, no one was in the mood to admire such things. All of them were focused on Wang Chong. 10 some Arab cities were there for the taking, but Wang Chong had decided to pause the war. This had left all of them mystified. Ha! Let me ask you, why is it that we advanced west from Talas to Samarkand, and then to Khorasan, losing so many people? Was it purely for the sake of battle? Wang Chong faintly smiled. Everyone in the hall was stunned. No one had expected Wang Chong to throw out a question like this. Almost everyone present was a general, and didn't generals live for the sake of battle? Was their entire purpose in existing not to win wars? No one could hide their confusion. Wang Chong saw their reactions and silently smiled. War was an art, and it was a means, not an end. Before waging a war, one had to understand what its objectives and purposes were. This was how one thought about war on a strategic level. But from the reaction of the people in this hall, this sort of idea was clearly beyond this era. A general's duty is to win in battle, but we've already defeated the Arabs, so do we need to continue fighting? We've already lost more than 100,000 men. Do you plan to fight until the last man? Wang Chong scanned the crowd. Wang Chong's words left them speechless. In the war between the Great Tang and Arabia, the Great Tang had emerged as the final victor, advancing all the way into the heartland of Arabia, taking Khorasan and even threatening Baghdad. But the Great Tang had paid an immense price for this. Yet a general had to lead their army in victorious battles. If this was not the duty of a soldier, what could it be? The objective in war was not just to kill people, nor was it battle for battle's sake. Everything was for the sake of profit and advantage. Only if a war was profitable could it be instigated. In this way, it would be a boon and not a burden to the people of a country. In history, it was wars purely meant for killing people that were denounced, the instigators castigated as warmongers, and these wars sometimes even dragged the entire country down. Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty had engaged in wars in all directions, and his political and military achievements were unrivaled, causing him to be hailed as a wise sovereign throughout the ages. But in his later years, his constant warmongering had placed a great burden on the people and caused the power of the country to wane. War is a multifaceted and incredibly large-scale endeavor. In terms of manpower, weapons, war horses, and rations, it consumes vast quantities of resources, which is why the Confucians find every possible reason to attack it. This is precisely why the civil officials don't get along with the martial officials. If a war cannot benefit the empire, no one will support it. Wang Chong sternly said to the crowd. The quarrels between civil and martial officials had originated long ago, through numerous dynasties. Every time one ignited, it would shake the court. There were even times when these quarrels would cause the collapse of the empire. Upon careful inspection, these quarrels had nothing to do with the difference between civil and martial officials, nor was it because civil officials were graceful while generals were boorish. The root cause was that the war being prosecuted was of no benefit to the empire. In the eyes of everyone, not just the civil officials, war was an all-consuming endeavor, consuming war horses, livestock, foodstuffs, and countless lives. All of these were negatives. When a war broke out on the border and a general decided to venture into enemy territory in a defensive counterattack, ultimately emerging victorious, all they succeeded in was not losing points, but they certainly weren't adding to their score. Overall, soldiers and war had always left a negative impression, with death being their constant companion. To put it another way, the starting of a war entailed mass enlistment and gathering of resources, creating panic amongst the people. But if war could bring profit, immense profit that could benefit the people, then everything was different. If one did not try to solve this problem at its roots, the conflict between civil and martial officials would never cease, and war would again and again enter the dead end of warmongering. All was silent within the hall, everyone pondering these words, Gao Xianji included. Not even Gao Xianji had ever seriously considered Wang Chong's question. Soldiers were used to fighting. Once one had the upper hand, the proper thing was to strike while the iron was hot and increase one's gains, not do as Wang Chong was doing. There were 10-some cities that could be taken one after the other, but he had decided to restrain the army and keep them at the ready. At this time, he had made a demand of war compensation to Arabia, using these 10-some cities as leverage. This sort of war was unprecedented in the history of the continent, let alone the Central Plains. One had to admit that Wang Chong always had some new idea that would cause others to think. But Wang Chong, 1 billion taels of gold is an enormous sum. Will the Arabs really agree? Chang Qianli creased his brow, unable to suppress his question. He had personally supervised the writing of the letter, and Lu Shi had been holding the brush. He had even read the letter again before sending it off, so he knew all of its contents. The number of 1 billion had even made his jaw drop when he saw it the first time. All this gold piled up would truly make a mountain. It was enough to buy many cities. Would the Arabs really agree to such a sky-high price? At the start, Chang Qianli had believed that this was just a strategic move from Wang Chong, for the sake of even greater goal, but it now appeared that Wang Chong was completely serious. Ha ha ha! Why not? Wang Chong confidently gazed at the people in the hall. 1 billion taels of gold is a lot, but it's still something that Arabia can handle. This empire's imperial household is far wealthier than you can imagine, and besides, they don't really have a choice in this matter. Just as all of you have seen, if Arabia refuses, we can swiftly cross the Tigris River and march on all their other cities. And we have another choice. We can give up on the other cities and make straight for the Arabian capital of Baghdad. 2,200 kilometers is completely doable with our abilities. Although we won't necessarily be able to breach the walls, we have more than enough strength to directly threaten the imperial capital of Arabia, shaking the empire and leaving a most shameful mark on their history. This humiliation is something that Arabia won't be able to buy back, even with 1 billion taels of gold. In addition, if my guess is correct, the Arabs are highly likely to feign accepting our demands, and even send us the 1 billion taels of gold. Meanwhile, they'll be hoping to buy time for their armies and thinking of ways to defeat us. Thus, no matter what, the chance of their sending these 1 billion taels of gold is 100%. Wang Chong's expression was brimming with confidence, his final words spoken with great vigor. There was no war that Wang Chong wasn't confident about prosecuting. Using war to demand compensation was a very new and curious thing in this world, but in another world it was commonplace, and many people in that world had used it to rapidly rise. War required benefit. After how long this war had gone on, Wang Chong needed a satisfying sum to serve as an answer that he could deliver to the imperial court and the people of the Great Tang. As if in response to Wang Chong's voice, the flapping of wings came from the air. A moment later, a massive golden-beaked hunting falcon descended from the skies, flying into the domed hall and landing on the golden conference table. The letter tied to the hunting falcon's leg was extremely prominent. Buzz! The sight of this hunting falcon immediately plunged the hall into silence. Everyone stared in shock and wonder, and some of them even stood up from their seats. 1 billion taels of gold. Would the Arabs really agree? Everyone held their breaths. Swoosh! A thin hand stretched out and untied the letter from the leg of the hunting falcon. A few moments later, Yuan Shusong suddenly became excited. "My lord, the Arabs have agreed to the 1 billion taels of gold. They've really agreed." "What?" These words sent shockwaves through the hall, everyone standing up in alarm. Let me see. The letter from the Arabs first went to Gao Xianji, and then Chang Qianli, Shi Yuanqing, Lu Shi Li Sai. Everyone in the hall had a chance to look at the letter. But other than Yuan Shusong, almost no one in the hall could read Arabic. This matter was truly too shocking. Wang Chong's demand of 1 billion taels of gold was stunning enough, but even more stunning was the Arab response. It didn't matter that they didn't recognize the words on the letter. All of them were just using this method to confirm the matter for themselves. Gaining a compensation of 1 billion taels of gold for winning a war was unthinkable even for someone like Gao Xianji. The spoils he had taken from attacking the Sher Kingdom were far inferior, like the difference between the dirt and the clouds. With a simple letter, Wang Chong had made everyone else's accomplishments lose their luster. Wonderful! Chang Qianli clenched his fists in excitement. No matter how many words were said, none of them could bring about as much shock as the letter the Arabs had written in reply. In a flash, everyone suddenly understood Wang Chong's strategic aim. 1 billion taels of gold. If we report this to the imperial court, none of the officials would dare to believe it. Even the civil officials and the Bureau of Personnel will change their attitudes. 1 billion taels of gold was an astronomical sum that even moved a vice protector general like Chang Qianli. Many soldiers had died at Talas, and the compensation payment alone was an enormous sum. Chang Qianli had previously been contemplating what to do. As the commander of these soldiers, and as a general whose duty was to stand on the side of his soldiers, he had to do his best to fight for their benefit, but now all his problems were easily solved. But the Arabs have also stated a few demands. At this moment, Yuan Shusong spoke, his brow creased in thought. The Arabs had requested that they can sign a treaty between us ending this war. The Arabs have said that they can promise to no longer invade the Great Tang, but they hope that we can withdraw from Khorasan and return the territory between Khorasan and Samarkand to them. In addition, we are no longer allowed to threaten or attack any other cities. Buzz. Yuan Shusong's words instantly caused the hall to fall silent, everyone exchanging glances. From the standpoint of the Great Tang, the Arabs' requests were not unacceptable. Exchanging 1 billion taels of gold for what was formerly Arab territory had no downsides for the Great Tang. And the Great Tang had pushed all the way to Khorasan, a matter without precedent since the start of recorded history. And for the soldiers, venturing deep into strange and unfamiliar territory and staying for the long term would not be to their greatest benefit, nor would it be of great benefit to the Great Tang. I object. Su Hanshan suddenly spoke in his cold and aloof voice, his expression unyielding. If we truly agree to the Arab requests, all our efforts will have been in vain. There must be a first time for everything. In the past, we occupied the strange lands of the western regions, and we operated in that region until the present. Now, we have occupied Khorasan and placed it firmly under our control. It is worth trying to control this place. Of course we can't agree. Wang Chong loudly laughed. The situation as it stands is that the Arabs desired the Central Plains but were beaten back by us, who countered and occupied Khorasan. The Arabs are paying us 1 billion taels of gold to compensate us for our losses, not for some equal exchange. It seems like His Majesty Mutasim still doesn't quite understand his situation, or how the losing side in a war should act. General Cheng, lead the army across the Tigris River and attack the closest city, Shandar. When you're just about to occupy it, withdraw back to Khorasan. Let them understand their situation. Understood. Leave this matter to me, Chang Qianli said with a smile. The way this war had developed had already surpassed his ability to comprehend, but Chang Qianli had complete faith in Wang Chong. No matter what Wang Chong said, he would do his utmost to carry out his orders. The generals discussed some more specific details of city defense before bringing an end to the conference and dispersing. When everyone was gone, leaving only Wang Chong and Gao Xianji, the latter couldn't help but ask, Wang Chong, Arabia still has quite a few capable people. Do you think that they will keep their promise? Lord Protector General, you said it yourself. Arabia still has quite a few intelligent people. How could they actually be talking peace with us? They're just trying to slow down our soldiers, Wang Chong immediately declared. Arabia was a country founded on war, and it delighted in conquest. From the very beginning, Wang Chong had determined that they would never be truly pursuing peace talks or any sort of peace treaty. But whether the Arabs were willing or not, they had to hand over the 1 billion taels of gold that Wang Chong had demanded. This was no time for them to be making requests. After emerging from the conference hall, Wang Chong ascended the western walls of Khorasan. Down below, the Tigris River was rumbling past. This broad river was a natural barrier, a defense line for the city of Khorasan. From the moment he set eyes on this river, Wang Chong had understood its important military value. From a certain perspective, Abu Muslim had been correct. Khorasan was truly a city that was very difficult to breach. A firm and deep voice came from behind Wang Chong. "General, have you considered how to deal with the hundreds of thousands of soldiers and numerous governors and generals Mutasim III will send in his fury? One cannot truly discuss peace with the Arabs. Even if they agree, General will find it very hard to leave in one piece." Wang Chong faintly smiled. "Haha, so General already knows of what's going on between us and the Arabs. Does General really believe that we will relinquish Khorasan and withdraw?" he asked without turning his head. He had naturally not come to the high walls of Khorasan to admire the grandeur of the Tigris. The Central Plains had many rivers of this sort. Bahram had invited him here. "Of course not, or else you would not have appeared here." Bahram spoke in rather stiff Arabic. Bahram did not know how to speak the language of the Great Tang, and Wang Chong did not know how to speak Khorasani. In the end, to communicate with each other, the two had compromised with speaking in Arabic. Bahram paused for some time before continuing, his brow creased in worry. "But the rebel soldiers all have this doubt. If you retreat, it will definitely set off a panic, and the army that we have managed to gather through great effort will immediately scatter. The Arabs will definitely pursue us and inflict severe losses." He truthfully did not care about the negotiations between the Great Tang and Arabia, and the 1 billion taels of gold was not his concern. From a certain perspective, Bahram believed this to be a good thing, because only if the Great Tang could obtain any benefit would it choose to remain. The Arabs were simply too strong, so strong that only the Great Tang in the east was capable of contending against them. So many rebels were willing to come out at this time because they saw a hope for resisting Arabia in the Great Tang. If the Great Tang withdrew from Khorasan, one could easily imagine the shock and dread this would instill. "I will have to depend on General's prestige to soothe them. The Great Tang will not retreat. At the very least, I will not do so without extremely good reason." Wang Chong smiled. "As for the hundreds of thousands of soldiers the Caliph will mobilize, there is no need for General to worry about this matter. The Arabs will not get the chance, at least not for the next 3 months. "Ah!" Even someone as experienced and knowledgeable as Bahram was momentarily taken aback by Wang Chong's words. Unclear as to why he was so confident. Wang Chong grinned and shot an imperceptible glance at the sky. His face was enigmatic. "In addition, if Great General is still worried, I can reveal a certain matter to Great General. I have already had a large number of ballista and heavy ballista bolts sent over, and the Great Tang's capital is also beginning to send reinforcements. The first group should already be en route and should arrive at Khorasan in just a few months. There should be no harm if General divulges this matter to the leaders of the rebel armies. This can at least help them dispel their worries and believe in the Great Tang's resolve," Wang Chong sternly said. Bahram was taken aback by Wang Chong's words, and then he sighed in relief. "General's words are enough. I will personally allay their worries." Bahram quickly left. Winds howled over the high walls of Khorasan, like the wailing of ghosts. The weather was clearly much colder than it had been in the past. No one except Wang Chong knew that a crisis without precedent in history was silently approaching, and it would be far more savage and ferocious than anyone could imagine. "Heh!" With a soft chuckle, Wang Chong departed the walls. Upon learning that the Great Tang was sending more soldiers, the rebel soldiers in Khorasan quickly ceased to worry. Half a day later, a brief and fierce conflict broke out in Shandar, the city across the Tigris River closest to Khorasan. Chang Chenli's army occupied Shandar, vanquished its Arab garrison, and destroyed several dozen buildings before withdrawing to Khorasan. This was an expression of might to Arabia, an expression of the Great Tang's will. If Arabia did not accede to the Great Tang's request, this probing attack would become a complete sacking. Several days later, when the news reached Baghdad, just as expected, it unleashed a storm of fury in all levels of Arab society. Bastard! Within his palace, the caliph was so furious that he even accidentally throttled his favorite hunting falcon to death. But even so, Wang Chong's plan had proved effective. Arabian gold was shipped out from Baghdad overnight, carried to Khorasan on the backs of more than 1,000 horses. A letter of much softer tone was swiftly dispatched to Khorasan. But at the same time, the speed at which the Arab army mobilized also increased. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were marching from the various war zones of Arabia, converging like thousands of streams on Khorasan. Nearly half of the Arab governors, driven on by the wrathful caliph, were surging to Khorasan. This was an unprecedented mobilization. The Great Tang's actions had fully provoked the supreme ruler of Arabia. The Arabian gold arrived much faster than expected. The sight of thousands of horses with small mountains of gold crossing the Tigris River and entering Khorasan had an immense mental impact on the army, causing the soldiers to buzz with chatter. On the same day, Chang Qianli composed a memorial in the names of Wang Chong and Gao Shenji, reporting this matter to the imperial court. 7 or 8 days later, the news arrived at the capital of the Great Tang. As expected, it set off great waves. This how? The Qishi Protector General and Anxi Protector General managed to get 1 billion taels of gold from Arabia. Upon hearing the news, even Wang Chong's most ardent opponent, the Grand Preceptor, could not sit still in his chair. War was a burden on the people, and each one would result in terrible losses and consume the country's resources. But he had never imagined that, at the final moment of this war, Wang Chong and the others would send back 1 billion taels of gold to the imperial court. Even someone as composed and steady as the Grand Preceptor, who rarely showed a happy expression, couldn't help but drop his jaw in astonishment. 1 billion taels. And in gold. How could this be? Not even 10 years of my Great Tang's tax revenue could reach this sum. All levels of the Bureau of Revenue were in a similar state of shock. From the minister to the lowest secretary, all of them were dumbfounded when they heard the news. Every war had the Bureau of Revenue scratching its head and racking its brains for ways to scrape up enough money. For this reason, of the 6 bureaus, the Bureau of Revenue opposed the military the most. But 1 billion taels of gold. Heavens! This was an astronomical number. With this sum, the Bureau of Revenue wouldn't have to complain about wars for a very long time. This puny country was actually this wealthy? When King Qi heard about the news from Khorasan, he was completely dumbfounded. In his mind, Arabia was still an insignificant country that wasn't even worth mentioning. The news that Wang Chong had extracted 1 billion taels of gold from this country left him in a daze. As a member of the imperial household, King Qi had never lacked for money, and he would often expend great sums of gold and silver to recruit powerful officials of the court. But no matter how self-assured he was in his wealth, not even he could produce 1 billion taels of gold. Even King Qi appeared dim and tiny before such a massive pile of gold. Even the strictest imperial censor of the imperial court suddenly found themselves mute. Meanwhile, back in Khorasan, unlocking power will cost user 10,000 points of destiny energy. Is user sure? Within Khorasan, the stone of destiny's voice resounded in Wang Chong's mind. Wang Chong was currently seated cross-legged on the floor, alone in his room. In front of him were 5 dazzling golden balls of light, showing the characters for mind, body, energy, techniques, and power. Wang Chong's eyes were fixed on the last ball of light, representing power. Power represented fortune, terrain, as well as heavenly phenomena. Wang Chong had long ago learned from the Stone of Destiny that this final category of rewards involved fortune, terrain, phenomena, and many other complicated things. Time, weather, terrain, and the minds of the people were all things covered by power. Taking advantage of the trend was the guiding principle of the abilities in this last category. Whether I can take advantage of the trends or not depends on whether these rewards from the Stone of Destiny are what I think they are, Wang Chong quietly said to himself. Confirm. With a thought, Wang Chong chose to spend the destiny energy to unlock power. Rumble. The moment Wang Chong confirmed his selection, the room suddenly shook as if the entire world was quaking. In a massive boom and a furious howl of wind, Wang Chong felt like the entire world had vanished. He could see a trembling dark shadow that rapidly began to expand. In the blink of an eye, the continent had appeared under his feet. Bang! A vast energy exploded in Wang Chong's mind. At that moment, Wang Chong felt like time and space had both vanished, and even his own body had vanished, leaving purely his senses. Down below, the miniature continent ballooned to 100 times its original size, and then 1,000, 10,000 times. On the contours of the continent, many other objects began to take form. Whoosh! A river swept across the continent, and Wang Chong could even feel the splash of its waters. And even more objects began to appear next to this river. This is Cultivation. Wang Chong recognized at a glance that tiny city emerging on the western end of the continent, next to the river. Wang Chong was already very familiar with Cultivation, and he soon saw more things that he was familiar with. Fluttering banners, many tents, and domed buildings the size of ants. If this was Cultivation, then the river next to it was undoubtedly the Tigris River. Farther west, Wang Chong could see even more of the continent, the first time Wang Chong had ever seen the entire Arabian Empire in this way. This was an extremely new and interesting sensation for Wang Chong. I wonder how the Arab soldiers are doing. With this thought, Wang Chong moved his eyes westward to Baghdad and the other war zones of Arabia. A moment later, as if in response to Wang Chong's thoughts, he could hear the cries of soldiers and clattering of weapons and armor. On this projection of the continent, Wang Chong could clearly make out tens of thousands of warhorses marching from various parts of Arabia, converging on Cultivation like thousands of rivers. Countless soldiers were marching day and night across the continent, making the 200,000 soldiers in Cultivation appear insignificant. 700,000, no, at least 800,000 soldiers. Even though Wang Chong had already mentally prepared himself, knowing that his threats were certain to enrage the Caliph, this number still left him stunned. Taking into account the losses related to the Battle of Talas and the Arab militia that had been killed, Wang Chong and Gao Xianxia had killed nearly 800,000 Arab soldiers. This number in any other empire would be almost impossible to bear, perhaps even more soldiers than could possibly be mustered. And yet, after such a severe wound, Arabia was still able to gather a vast force of 700,000 to 800,000 soldiers in a short time. This sort of mobilization capability and military reserve was enough to make any other faction tremble in fear. Even if a significant portion were just militia, it was still an astonishing number. From this, one could see why Arabia was known as a country of war. This time, the wrathful caliph had mobilized almost his entire military. The 200,000 rebels at Cultivation would find it very difficult to stop them. But to Wang Chong there was no need to stop them. He had never once imagined relying on the 200,000 rebel soldiers to stand against all of Arabia. History has already undergone a massive change, but I hope that matter hasn't been affected. A thought occurred to Wang Chong, and he quickly looked up at the sky. A few moments later, his eyes flashed and he faintly smiled. The world had experienced a significant change. The Great Tang had not only not been defeated in Talas, but its army had marched all the way to Cultivation and now threatened Baghdad. However, that matter he remembered had not been affected in the slightest. The more you send, the more will die. This time you will pay the heaviest price. Wang Chong's mind quickly interacted with one of the Stone of Destiny's power rewards. User confirms spending 10,000 points of destiny energy in exchange? Confirm. The Arab soldiers arrived much faster than predicted. Only a few days later, the scouts and Khorasani spies that Wang Chong had dispatched sent back word that a force of more than 300,000 soldiers had gathered in an area 100 some kilometers from the Great Tang forces. They were rapidly building up fortifications to guard against any possible ambush or offensive from the Great Tang. Moreover, even more soldiers were arriving from the rear, and the Arab forces were swelling in number. From the report sent by the spies, the Arabs had already gathered at least 2 great generals. The commander is Arabia's empire's white corpse Hüller. This person has a very cruel and restrained personality, and more importantly, this person has always been an extremely meticulous commander. His defenses are almost impenetrable. If we force an attack, we will find it very hard to gain any advantage, explained Bahram from next to Wang Chong. He knew all the governors and commanders of Arabia like the back of his hand. In this aspect, the Great Tang was dearly lacking. Much of the information Wang Chong had obtained had been given to him by Bahram. Even the tightest defense has a flaw. It just depends on what we choose. Wang Chong softly chuckled. In the Battle of Talas, the Great Tang had overcome 500,000 with 100,000, and they were only facing 300,000 here. Wang Chong had never underestimated his opponents, but even the Arab war god Qutayba had died to him. So what need did he have to fear a measly empire's white corpse? No matter how strong Hüller was, he couldn't be stronger than Qutayba. Bahram froze, and then he immediately thought of something and nodded. Hüller was not some nobody of the empire, and Wang Chong was probably the only one who would dare to evaluate Hüller in such a way. But Bahram was keenly aware that this young commander was different from any other person he had ever encountered. The inconceivable reversals he had accomplished imbued him with the confidence to say such things before anyone. Xue Qianjun, write a letter for me to the Caliph of Arabia, stating that even though we've already signed a treaty, Arabia has still dispatched 300,000 soldiers to Khorasan. This has made us feel threatened and is a blatant breaking of their promise. Within one day, Arabia must withdraw its army. Otherwise, we cannot be blamed for mobilizing our army to maintain the treaty. Wang Chong said without turning his head. Upon hearing these words, Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, and the others around Wang Chong all smiled. The Great Tang side understood everything that the Caliph was thinking, but the Arabs continued to play deaf and dumb, pretending that they were unaware. This general understands. Xue Qianjun bowed and quickly took his leave. Flap, flap. Several messenger birds flew into the air. One was headed toward Baghdad, while the other was headed toward the empire's white corpse and his 300,000 Arab soldiers. Boom! Wang Chong's letter was like a descending boulder, setting off an uproar the moment it landed in the Arab camp. Bastard! This bullying goes too far. Hüller was known for his composed personality and ability to keep his emotions off his face. But when he received Wang Chong's letter, he couldn't help but slam his fist against the table, his eyes spitting fire. The Tang had already obtained 1 billion taels of gold from Arabia, but after getting a deal, they were still trying to barter, turning around and questioning the motives of Arabia. This was simply too much. Arabia had always respected strength and courage, and the other small and weak kingdoms had always had to look up in respect. This was the first time it had ever been so brazenly threatened. My lord, what do we do? They've only given us 1 day to withdraw. Do we really have to comply with them? One of Hüller's subordinate generals cautiously said, his head lowered. The Arabs had by now gathered 300,000 soldiers, 100,000 more than the enemy, and so they normally would ignore such a letter. But everyone knew that 100-some li away, behind the high walls of Khorasan, was the fierce and unstoppable coalition army of the Great Tang and Khorasan. Given their past record, not even outnumbering them by 100,000 soldiers would be enough to overcome them. Impossible! The eyes of the empire's white corpse burned with rage as he immediately rejected the notion. No one can threaten Arabia like this. Pass on my order. Tighten the defenses. I'd like to see what they can do about it. Yes. The deputy quickly departed with the orders. Wait a moment. Hüller suddenly called his deputy back, taking in a deep breath as his expression cooled. Write a letter for me to the Great Tang. Arabia did not intentionally break our agreement with the Great Tang. This mobilization is just a regular mobilization to carry out necessary defensive work, and we hope that the Great Tang will not think too much of it. The deputy was stunned, but he quickly came around, lowering his head and quickly departing. Flap, flap. An hour later, an Arabian hunting falcon soared into the sky, crossing the tributary of the Tigris River and entering Khorasan. 5 minutes later, Wang Chong, Gao Xianji, Chang Qianli, Li Sai, and the others had all gathered. After reading the letter, all of them had rather amused looks on their faces. All of them knew what the Arabs were up to and what they were planning. Shi Yuanqing suddenly broke the silence. Lord Protector General, how should we reply to this letter? Reply? Do we need to reply? The Arabs don't think that we would accept such far-fetched reasoning from them. Wang Chong heartily laughed. The Arabs were playing a game of words. Everyone understood what they were preparing to do. Since he knew that they were preparing for a war, Wang Chong wouldn't just sit back on his laurels and let them gather without any obstacle. Great General Baram, General Chang, Li Sai, get ready. Let's go see this empire's white corpse, Great General, Wang Chong said. Baram, Chang Qianli, and the others all nodded, a smile on their lips. Several hours later, in the city of Shirfan, 100-some kilometers from Khorasan, the Arab soldiers had organized into disciplined ranks, their bodies seething with killing intent. This army of 300,000 was prepared at any time to fight a fierce and large-scale battle. Focus! Everyone, get to your positions. Order the craftsman team to hurry up. If 5,000 barracks aren't finished by tomorrow, immediately execute half of the craftsmen. Hurry and feed the war horses. In just 5 days, we will be battling with the Tang. Whips cracked through the air as the Arab generals spurred on the craftsmen and soldiers into erecting the camps. Shirfan was not a large city, and 300,000 soldiers had already made the city seem rather packed. And there were still 400,000 to 500,000 soldiers on the way. An army of 800,000 required the construction of a vast number of facilities. On the high walls of the city, an Arab deputy bowed as he reported, "My lord, the construction in the city is about finished, and the external defenses are in the middle of being strengthened. For the short term, we should not have to worry about the Tang." Hewler gave a satisfied nod and took his eyes away from the horizon. The enemy this time was extremely powerful. Hundreds of thousands of Arab soldiers, Qutayba, and other great generals had already died at their hands. Everyone in Arabia, Hewler included, now viewed these Tang soldiers with great apprehension. Reporting. As he was thinking, an Arab horseman suddenly galloped out of the distance, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. The scout had an extremely pale face and seemed to be in great panic. A large force of Tang soldiers is marching toward Shirfan. Bang! These words immediately sent shockwaves through the city. On the walls, Hewler and the other Arab governors paled. No one had expected the enemy to dare launch an offensive while the Arabs had the advantage of both numbers and position. Bastard! We just signed a treaty and even sent them the 1 billion taels of gold. The ink isn't even dry yet, and yet they're already tearing it to shreds. Hewler was both shocked and furious. In previous wars, no one had ever dared to treat Arabia like this. Moreover, the Great Tang had just received 1 billion taels of gold. But now they were tearing up the treaty to attack them. This was simply too despicable. Reporting. A few moments later, a shout and the thundering of hooves could be heard from the distance. Another Arab scout with a panicked expression galloped toward Shirfan. Reporting to my lord. A combined force of 7,000 Tang and rebel soldiers is heading toward us. They are less than 3 li away. So fast. All the people on the walls grimaced at these words. In the brief interval between the two scouts, the enemy had already gotten within 3 li of Shirfan. At this speed, they would soon appear at the walls. Arrogant. They're far too arrogant. An Arab governor on the walls became furious. These Tang of the Eastern world had no regard for others. The Arabs had only lost once, but they still had a vast army and many governors and generals. Hewler was also internally livid. Everyone hear my order. No one is to act without my word. I'd like to see what this Tang commander wants. With Hewler's order, the atmosphere around Shirfan turned somber. Just a few moments later, there was a thundering of hooves and a great roaring as an army charged out of a cloud of dust. At a distance of 600 to 700 meters, Hewler viciously called out, "Who goes there?" His voice was brimming with energy, resounding over Shirfan like a peal of thunder. "Ha ha ha, is that the Empire's white corpse on the walls? Hewler of the Arabian Empire?" A loud laugh could be heard as a red and black warhorse rode out from the army of 7,000, its mane glossy and bright. The gaze of its rider, sharp as a sword, was focused on the 3 Arab governors standing on the walls. Before Hewler could say anything, an Arab general at his side shouted in rebuke, "Who is it down there? Who dares to speak the Lord Governor's name?" "Ha ha ha, Hewler, even you Arabs have a day like this. I have come to deliver a message from the great Tang's Chishi Protector General. Immediately withdraw all your soldiers from Shurfan. Otherwise, the Tang will move out from Khorasan in response to your treachery and attack. Just like Qutayba, all of you will die." Jalali looked up to the walls and laughed. Jalali was a Khorasani and also a member of the Sassanid dynasty. For all these years, only Khorasani like him who had been oppressed by the Arabs knew what sort of life they had lived. In front of the Arabs, all the Khorasani were cautious and meek, not even daring to speak so loudly. They were truly second-class citizens. Moreover, all the Khorasani were burdened with an incredibly heavy tax. This was all not too long ago. But now, they could stand in front of 300,000 Arab soldiers and exchange words with a powerful governor like Hewler. Impudent! Arrogant! Hewler and the other Arab governors and generals were infuriated by these words. A mere 7,000 soldiers dared to act so brazenly before them. They were seeking death. "Come! Dispatch 20,000 men and kill them all," Hewler suddenly ordered, his face a sheet of ice. Complying with Hewler's order, the gates opened and 20,000 Arab soldiers, their expressions grim and dour, charged out of the city and toward the 7,000 soldiers. "Ha ha ha! Let's go!" Seeing that his goal had been achieved, Jalali waved his hand and immediately led his men away. "The message has been delivered. It's best if you behave yourselves." Jalali heartily laughed as he jeered. "Where are you going?" The leading Arab general, seeing that the enemy was getting away free of consequence, immediately urged his soldiers to move faster. The 2 armies swiftly disappeared into the distance. Several li away, the leading Arab general, Abdullah, sternly ordered, "Damn it! Hurry up! Don't let them run. The Tigris River is just up ahead. They can't escape." With a stab of his scimitar into the hindquarters of his horse, his army frenziedly charged forward. But before they could get very far, there was a fierce neighing and countless soldiers, charging in at an unexpected angle, thrust into Abullah's army like a sharp arrow. "Not good! Retreat!" Abdullah paled and tried to lead his army away, but it was too late. "It's too late to think about escape. Hand over your lives." Jalali pulled out his sword and turned his 7,000 soldiers around. Rumble! They charged into the Arab ranks and immediately threw them into chaos. What? Abullah's army was wiped out. On the high walls, when Hewler received the news, he was struck dumb. In just a few moments, Abullah's 20,000 men had been vanquished. This was far too fast. How many soldiers did they have? Hewler asked, anxious and doubtful. Other than the previous 7,000, the enemy had 8,000 lying in ambush. There were 15,000 in total. What? How? Blurted the 2 Arab governors at Hewler's side before he could say anything. If the enemy had more soldiers, then the loss was understandable, but there were only 15 or 16,000 soldiers, a smaller force than what the Arabs had dispatched. Just how had they managed to kill so many people in such a short amount of time? Could the legends be true? Were there soldiers from the strongest Eastern army in history that were even able to overcome Qutayba's soldiers? But how could that be? From the information they had gathered, although the Tang army had won, it had been left with only 20 to 30,000 soldiers. And the force just now had primarily been composed of those rebel soldiers that usually scattered like mice. When did this motley force suddenly become so formidable? Pass on my order. Dispatch all the hunting falcons. Only now did Hewler sense that something was wrong. He had originally believed that the enemy had only sent a small force to make some trouble and show off their might, but it now seemed that this was not the case. Flap, flap. A moment later, countless hunting falcons soared out of Shurfan in every direction. A few moments later, the hunting falcons and scouts returned with an accurate count of the enemy. 20,000 was the number of soldiers they were facing, and this force of Tang and Khorasani was coming straight for Shurfan. Pass on my order. 100,000 soldiers will follow me out of the city. I want to personally test the power of this force. Hewler was furious. One mistake was enough. This time he would personally deal with the Tang and the rebels. Boom! The gates opened, allowing 100,000 soldiers to flood out of the city. The remaining 200,000 soldiers remained in the rear, ready to move out the moment something seemed off. Although only 100,000 soldiers had been dispatched, the two armies were in tune with each other and would not give the enemy any weakness to exploit. Rumble. Not long after Hewler had brought his army out of the city, he spotted a massive golden dragon banner on the horizon. And then, to the tune of banging war drums, an army of Tang, Khorassani, and other rebel soldiers appeared, marching toward Shirfan. In the center of this army was a black-haired and armored youth who immediately caught Hewler's attention. It's him! Hewler's eyes narrowed at the sight of this young figure, and his face froze in shock. He had never expected the Great Tang's young commander to personally show himself here. Hewler and the Arab soldiers had heard far too much about this young Tang commander. They even had detailed information on his appearance, bearing, weapons, and armor. Thus, even though Hewler had never seen Wang Chong before, he could recognize him almost immediately. But this was not why Hewler viewed him with such apprehension and regard. The most important thing of all was that everyone in the Arabian Empire knew that he had been the one to kill Qutayba and Aibak. Everyone, be careful. This person is highly likely to be the young commander of the Great Tang, Wang Chong. Hewler warily stared at the approaching army. The other two Arab governors, Pahlavi and Karim, said nothing, but both of them were clearly extremely worried. Gallop! A few moments later, the two armies approached each other and stopped, entering a distant stalemate. Tang, you've gone back on your word. You've clearly received our gold, but now you're breaking the treaty. Truly despicable. Karim, the governor of Hamadan, rode forward, his eyes flashing. Although his reputation and prestige were far inferior to the likes of Qutayba and Abu Muslim, Karim was undoubtedly a member of the second tier of Arab governors. Moreover, Karim had always had an unyielding personality, and even in front of Wang Chong, he was fearless. How could it be us who broke the treaty? The first to attack were you, not us. Speaking in a mellow and dignified voice, Wang Chong slowly trotted forward on the white-hoofed shadow. His expression was calm and placid, and his every movement exuded a natural air of admirable strength and character. Any other imperial great general of the same level paled in comparison to him. Buzz! All the Arab generals grimaced at these words. Although it had always been the Tang and Khorassani challenging and provoking the Arabs, in the end, it truly was the Arabs that had begun the pursuit in earnest. Bastard! You were the one who laid an ambush there and lured us in. This was clearly a premeditated scheme. An Arab general next to Hewler couldn't help but retort. Humph! If we hadn't made preparations, you would have killed all 7,000 of those soldiers. Shot back Xue Qianjun, riding out from behind Wang Chong. You! The Arab general was instantly at a loss for words. Although everyone knew that those 7,000 men had just been bait, Xue Qianjun's words were also true. If the Tang had not been one move ahead, those 20,000 Arab soldiers would have been returning victorious. There's no need to say any more. Hewler extended a hand and stopped the general behind him. He rode forward and glared at Wang Chong. Tang, you are also a renowned general of a generation. Are the words of the Great Tang really this untrustworthy? Heh! Wang Chong faintly smiled and urged his horse forward, his face brimming with contempt. Trustworthy or not, complying with the treaty or destroying it, these are things that I should be asking you. Didn't I already tell you? In one day you must withdraw from Shirfan. Since you're not complying, you are naturally the first to go against the agreement, and I can't be blamed for ordering my army to advance westward and go on the offensive. You! Hewler instantly paled at these words. When had the strongest empire of the West ever been forced by another into this kind of situation? I will count to 3. If, after 3 seconds, you still haven't started to retreat, then prepare to die. Wang Chong extended a finger, his body exuding a domineering aura. 1, 2, 3. Before Hewler could react, Wang Chong had announced the countdown and extended his third finger. A moment later, the 20,000 soldiers of the coalition army bellowed and charged. Domineering. Too domineering. Wang Chong had said that he would give the Arabs 3 seconds, but there had been no break. Without any time for the Arabs to react, he had counted down to 3 and ordered his army to attack. The Arabian Empire had conquered countless foes and encountered so many formidable great generals, but not a single one of them had ever been so domineering and so iron-fisted, exuding such a powerful pressure that one could barely breathe. Kill! With a mighty roar, 20,000 soldiers rushed forward in a torrent of steel. Outrageous! Even though Hewler, the Empire's white corpse, usually showed no emotion on his pale face, this time, even he couldn't help but show a little anger. No matter how powerful his opponent was, it was just an army of 20,000. They were made of flesh and blood like all the rest. Did they really think that they could contend against an army of 100,000? And even if they could overcome 100,000, farther back was Shirfan, which contained 200,000 more soldiers. Kill them! With an icy face, Hewler pulled out his sword and gave the order to attack. Bang! The earth quaked as the 100,000 Arab soldiers charged forward to meet the Tang, Khorasani, and other rebel soldiers. Boom! 20,000 collided with 100,000 in a stunning impact. But this battle was foreordained to turn out differently from how Hewler imagined. As the two armies clashed like primordial beasts, two groups of soldiers charged out from the left and right flanks of the Tang army, riding in long arcs before stabbing into the sides of the Arabs. Meanwhile, the rest of the army stabbed into the Arab ranks like a sharp sword and cut straight through it. Cutting formation! Right after they had charged through the enemy formation, the several thousand Wuxian cavalry scattered like petals and began to slice through the Arab army like so many knives. In mere moments, the center of the Arab army collapsed into chaos. Bastard! Kill them! Hewler was enraged at this sight. For any army, the collapse of the center was extremely lethal. Although the enemy was fierce, they were not so formidable as to be invincible. Arabia still had the advantage in numbers, and there were still 200,000 soldiers in the rear waiting for the order, ready to charge out at any time. But while Hewler was still clinging to hope, suddenly, clang! There was a metallic clang as an invisible energy spread over the battlefield. Clang, clang, clang. All the halos on the bodies of the 100,000 soldiers began to weaken, and their auras plunged with frightening speed, leaving them shocked and terrified. What's going on? Just what's happened? Why has my strength dropped so much? Careful! The sudden drop in strength threw the Arab formation into more chaos than the Wuxian cavalry's cutting formation. The latter was physical harm, but the former was an immense mental panic that had come out of nowhere. And all this was only the beginning. There was yet another metallic clattering, and this time, it was the Arab generals' turn to have their strength plummet. Ah! Screams of alarm and panic came from behind them, and when they turned their heads, they realized that these sounds of turmoil were coming from Shirfan. Hewler and the governors beside him instantly turned grim. None of them had expected the range of their opponent's attack to be so vast that it even encompassed the 200,000 soldiers that weren't even taking part in this battle. The bane of the battlefield halo. The bane of generals halo. Wang Chong faintly smiled atop his white-hoofed shadow as he unleashed his two most powerful war halos. These Arab soldiers were not as elite as the armies under the command of Qutayba or Osman, so they suffered far more severe effects. The bane of the battlefield and the bane of generals were not invincible halos. As long as an expert of the great general level took action, consuming energy to unleash their own halo, they could weaken the effects of these two halos. But would Wang Chong give them this sort of chance? Hurry! Use great general halos to weaken these two energies. Pahlavi loudly called out, shocked and infuriated. Although he had no idea what sort of halo his enemy was using, he was still a governor of Arabia and a great general expert. He was able to quickly determine the countermeasure. But before he could finish, the earth quaked and an enormous energy rose from the earth to surge toward the three governors like a tsunami. Since you don't want to retreat, remain here forever. Wang Chong's voice was bone-piercingly cold. It resounded over the world like the god of death announcing the fates of the three. Impudent! The three looked up at the same time, but before Hewler could react, the governor to his right side, Kareem, suddenly shot furiously into the air. Clang, clang, clang. In a flash, black-red halos erupted from his body, one after the other. Kareem, watch out! Hewler paled. Kareem had always been the most irascible of the Arab governors, and at a time like this, his trait had become a fatal flaw. No one understood more than him that this youth from the east was stronger than the great generals of any other country they had conquered before. He was not something Kareem alone could deal with. Bang! With no time to think, Hewler shot into the air like a cannonball. Rah! As he soared into the sky, the air resounded with the howl of a devil. Hewler left shockwaves in the air as he rose. Suddenly a ghastly white foot extended out of the void, followed by a pale white figure. As everyone watched, a massive white corpse more than 30 meters tall appeared behind Hewler. This sight suddenly made everyone understand why he was called the Empire's White Corpse. Awoo! The moment the corpse appeared, its eyes exploded with light like dazzling suns. At the same time, it gave a bloodthirsty howl infused with powerful psychic energy ripples. Everyone in the area suddenly felt an instinctual fear, as if they were ants encountering a frightful predator. They trembled in fear and began to flee. Not even the Arabs were immune to this effect. Although he was an Arab governor, the Empire's White Corpse had a fighting style different from all the others. The massive corpse that Hewler had summoned possessed powerful psychic energy, and its terrifying howl intimidated even Saint Martial experts, instilling deep dread into their hearts. But before the howl could spread to the entire battlefield, an even more terrifying energy exploded forward, impacting against the pale white corpse. Yo wow! The giant corpse trembled as it covered its head with its hands and began to scream. The aura around its body fell into chaos. Moreover, the two dazzling suns that were its eyes began to dim. At the same time, Hewler groaned, blood flowing from his ears, nose and eyes. This corpse was merely his avatar, and its life was linked to his own. The avatar being injured was no different from him being injured. Psychic energy. A hint of fear finally appeared in Hewler's eyes. His hell-white corpse was actually a supreme psychic energy technique that not even Saint Martial experts could block, let alone others. But Hewler had never imagined that there would be someone on the other side with an even stronger grasp of psychic energy. Ugh! Hewler was far from the only one to suffer from Wang Chong's psychic energy attack. To his left and right, both Pahlavi and Kareem had also been struck, and even their attacks had been slowed by this formidable assault. Psychic Storm. Wang Chong had further developed Mazel's Shadow Pierce. Shadow Pierce was a technique that targeted only one person, but Wang Chong had developed it into a technique that could attack many people at once. Even if he was facing many Saint Martial experts, he could use this move to jolt their minds and disrupt their souls. Great destruction art. An icy and emotionless voice resounded in the ears of all the Arabs, and a moment later, Wang Chong had unleashed the strongest technique of the great Yin-Yang heaven creation art. Not good. Careful. Everyone immediately felt a surge of terror in their hearts. But it was too late. Boom! 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 A massive gust of wind howled down from the sky and impacted against the ground. Then a huge explosion hurled several figures into the sky like ragdolls. Run! Hewler began to flee, his face stricken with fear. If one looked carefully, one would notice that one of his hands was hanging limply at his side, blood streaming down it. This single strike had severely wounded Hewler. A destructive power was wreaking havoc in his body, and it was extremely sharp and vicious. Hewler had already tried several dozen times to expel it, but all his attempts had failed. Impossible! Just what sort of energy could be this terrifying? Hewler's heart was thumping. He had originally believed that the strongest this person could be was Abu Muslim's level, but not even Abu Muslim could have defeated him like this. Before Hewler could run very far, he heard a wretched scream. Ah! As Hewler continued to flee, a massive energy swiftly vanished from his perception. Pahlavi. Hewler's mind sank as he recognized the voice. I already said before, all of you were seeking death. Wang Chong floated in the air as he spoke in a chilling voice to the Arabs, one of his hands gripping Pahlavi's neck. He viciously threw Pahlavi's corpse to the ground like it was a punctured leather bag.